Hello and welcome to another free code session. My name is Jason Bach, and I'm going to go through some things that I fixed with Rocks, the 7.0.0 Alpha 2 version, though by the time this video actually gets scheduled and released on YouTube, I would have hoped to have, I think, an Alpha 3 and then eventually the final 7.0 release once .NET 7 is released. That's the plan. And again, the number, I didn't plan to have it match the version, nor do I plan to make it stick with the version, but you know, that's just the way it's kind of worked out. Got my coffee on this morning. So I've published this. It's been 3 days or 4 days since I published it, and I'm already starting to forget what I did with some of these things. So I want to go through this before I forget. And this has been a lot of work. This has been, it seemed like with every single issue, there was always like a corner case or a spot where I started to feel like I was falling down into a hole and I couldn't get out of. And it was kind of frustrating. And eventually I would, climb back out and get it fixed. But it was, the struggles were real. By the way, I got to adjust my camera here. Hold on. Sorry. Don't mean to. There we go. It felt like it was a little bit too off. So yeah, I've been traveling for the last 2 weeks as well, and it still doesn't seem like it's quite there. Are you there now? I think you're a little bit better. Okay. Anyway, I've been traveling to two weeks, and this thing, I have a kind of like a jury rig stand and on my laptop, and when I put it back on, I got to kind of play with it a little bit to make sure it's level. So in any event, there's actually a tweet too. If I can find the link for it, I'll put it up. But one day I got back to the hotel, and that night I didn't have much to do, so I was starting to work on one of these things, and it took 2 hours, and it wasn't 2 straight hours. I was, I'd watch a video or something like that, but it took a while to finally get a test just to fail the way I wanted it to, because then I could prove that when I fixed it, it worked. Some of these were really fun to discover. So we got a lot here. Let's go through the list, and I'll explain briefly on these. Some a little bit more in depth than others, but just kind of go through what that code generator app found and what I discovered and what I had to fix. So the first one is if an interface, and I'm going to go from the bottom top. So if an interface has static abstract members, Rocks will raise this exception. And this is basically because you can't pass in an interface with static abstract members to a generic parameter. Now, I could leave that for the compiler to tell me that that's an issue, but there's a timing thing here. I never actually even looked into seeing, well, would this cause an issue? Could I find this diagnostic in the code? Now that I'm talking about this, that may be something I do and change this so that I actually look for the diagnostic number that matches when you pass in an interface with these members. Either way, I had to handle the case where you did this because you can't do it. You can't pass them in. So that seemed like the most reasonable thing to do, because it stops Rocks in its tracks and it doesn't try to handle any of these cases. So for now, they are not supported. So sad, but that's the way it is. Method matching now correctly handles cases with either parameters or return types or using generic type parameters. I don't quite remember what that issue was. I did take notes on a lot of these too. I started in my notes folder in the repo. Some of these I have a fair amount of notes tied to them. So if you really were interested, you could go look them up. But this one, I don't remember exactly what the problem was or what the case was. Constraint ordering has been fixed. So there were some cases where, and you'll see this with a couple of other issues, where constraints that were being emitted, they have to be in a certain order. And trying to find out what this order was, I didn't find it documented anywhere. So I even asked out on a Discord channel that the C# team watches, And they even said they don't, they didn't know offhand, even where in the code it says, here's the order that must be enforced. So after a couple of experiments in Sharp Lab, I figured out what order that they should be put in. And so this fixed one of them. And then there was another one that's going to come up that I had to fix another thing. So took care of that. For makes allow now shows up in properties. This is actually something I didn't create. I actually wrote an article about 2 years ago when I was dealing with this when I had the reflection version of rocks, and that allow null ends up in a weird spot and you have to handle it correctly. And I wasn't doing it for makes. So it was funny because I was looking stuff up and I ended up finding my own article that I wrote a couple years ago. How many times does that happen? For makes, task or value task, return types are now marked with the null forgiving operator when the return type is not nullable. So, okay, I think I just realized I needed to do that, and then the compiler shut up and it worked. The constraints and generic, so if generic parameters have constraints, I realized I needed to put them on the extension methods as well, because I needed to make sure that the generics had the same constraints when you were setting up expectations via those extension methods. So I simply copied the constraints that I was putting on the mock and made sure that they were on the extension methods. So that was a simple one to fix. So I was looking through the list, and there wasn't something in here that talked about this. And I've been editing videos that are going to be, I'm now up through the ones that are going to be published in November. And I don't think I had recorded videos where I was making all the types global. Did I put that in Alpha 1? No, I didn't. Okay, so I must have missed it here, but that wasn't actually a fix for... Actually, hold on. Was this part of that? I want to just check this one out, because that work was a lot of work. So hold on. No, that was just the fact that I had to do that. There was one that was called the type problem. Type problem. Yeah, I actually finally fixed that, and I don't have it in the changelog. Oh well. So that's actually something else that I fixed. So I no longer use this namespace gatherer. I no longer try to be cute with making the code cleaner in the sense that I just use simple type names. And so I should have done this a long time ago. I now have fully qualified names. I use global, colon everywhere. So if you look at the code, it's arguably harder to read now, but it's simpler to generate, and it makes things unambiguous. There's a couple spots where I'm using extension methods. So I will I will emit a couple of using statements. And if those become problems, then you can just call the extension method directly as a static method and pass the object in as the first parameter. So I just made exceptions for a couple of cases, but for the vast amount of stuff now, it's all fully qualified. And that was also fun because I create types and then I have to reference those types, and some of those types get identifiers generated. I'll come to that in a second. So that became a little challenging to figure out how to do that correctly as well. But this is something I should have done from the get-go. And if you're writing source generators, I highly recommend don't fall into the trap that I did. Just use fully qualified names. Your life is going to be much easier in the long run because you don't have to worry about types from different assemblies that have the same name from different namespaces. And yeah, that just fixes all that. All right, so parameter names will no longer collide with variables. This was actually a fun one. So, because it took a couple of iterations to get this API, this implementation, the way I wanted it to be. But I ended up with this thing called variable naming context. And so what you do is you pass in either a method or the parameters. And then I just use an indexer to say, hey, here's the variable name I want. Do I currently have that? And if I don't with the parameters, or I haven't used it before, I think, then I just say, hey, give me back that name. Otherwise, I will increment by, a number to come up with a unique identifier. And then every subsequent ask of that variable name will give me back that unique name. And if I look at where I've been using this, which is now everywhere I make a variable, I do this. So let's see if I can find one that's a little easy to see what it's doing. So just for example, like a spot where I have an extension method, even self, I will now use everywhere I just say naming context self. And so when I'm in a method that I'm generating code, I create one of these variable naming contexts, and then I just do this everywhere. And I can keep doing it like down here because it will always give me like the same one or the same unique one that I generated before. And so this gets rid of the problem that there were cases where a type had a parameter with the name result, and I'm generating a variable called result. And so that collided. And I kind of knew that in the back of my head that would be a possibility, but I kind of said, and we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Well, I ran into it. And now this is just something I do everywhere in code. And it cleans things up. It makes things resilient to that ever happening again. I just have to remember if I ever generate new code to always put variables in that naming context to make sure I'm generating something that won't collide. Types that use C# keywords for parameters are now handled by rocks. And this was kind of interesting too, because you may have noticed I have an @ here. Everywhere when I'm putting parameters in, when I'm using variables, I always put the @ sign in front of it now, which I first thought I should only do that for parameters, because I never make variables that have names that are C# keywords, but parameters may be done that way. And I first thought, well, I'd only do that for things that are keywords, but then I found out there's keywords and contextual keywords, and it gets a little messy. Well, somebody from Microsoft said, you can just put an @ sign in front of everything, variables, parameters, and it just works. And so whether it needs it or not, I always put the @ sign in front of it now. So it's like naming context, fully qualified types, @ signs in front of all these things. And now I just don't run into these problems anymore. So that just got solved by throwing in an @ sign, and that just works. So great. Generated delegates now use a SHA. So get hash code from string will change every time I run the code. And that was making it a little problematic to write tests because I wasn't doing something that was, I forget the name. It's consistent, but there's a specific word that I'm trying to think of, and deterministic, I think is the word I'm thinking of. So what I did is I created a extension method for string that uses a SHA-1 to create a hash that will be consistent every time I run it. It's longer, it makes it longer, but oh well. This only happens when I'm doing projected types. Shims don't count because they will be unique just by the way everything falls out. But these projected types do have to have this code added on to the end. So this takes care of it. This makes it unique. And now I can write tests because that value for a particular signature of a method will always be the same no matter how many times I run the test. Constraints again, only one of these are, so you can only have one of these constraints added to a generic parameter. There were cases that were coming up where I was inadvertently writing more than one of these. I think it had to do with unmanaged or struct, but now I just say, well, one of these have to be generated, so I just say, write one of them, and that fixed that problem. Yeah, this one. Parameters that do not have nullable annotations and have a null optional value are now handled correctly. You can write code if you don't have nullable enable. You can write code that says like object my parameter equals null. And you don't have the nullable reference annotation on there. And that's fine. It's weird. You really should annotate it, but it might be code that hasn't been changed yet. And so when I was running into it, that was causing issues. And so what I ended up having to do is figure out that it should have a nullable annotation on it, and just make sure you can put in the override or your implementation of that in your code with a nullable annotation, and that's fine. The compiler doesn't bark at you. So kind of a simple fix at the end, but it's kind of a weird one too. Types that have internal abstract members. So I ran into a type that was public and had accessible members, but it also had inaccessible ones that were abstract, not just virtual, they were abstract. And so what that means is you can see it, but you can't derive from it in your own code. Unfortunately, Rocks wasn't picking that up, and so it was trying to create a mock, and of course it couldn't, because it was saying you don't have like permission or whatever the error was to override these members. So now I have code in there to say, if you run into that case, it just flags it with a diagnostic and says, can't be mocked because it has internal abstract members. This is the fun part of this code generation app, because it really found a lot of things that I just did not think of. All these are coming from that, or at least most of these are. Support types with hidden members. Yeah. So that's the new keyword. If you have a method that has that's virtual in a base class, and then you say new in the subclass, it hides it. If you remember a language called Visual Basic, that's called shadowing. It's essentially the same thing. I don't know if it's technically the same, but it's pretty much the same thing. And it can lead to some really weird, bizarre cases in terms of how do you handle that. It should be overridden. Should you do an explicit implementation? It gets really odd. So, and there's no support for it either in Roslyn, in the sense that they know it, but as I found out, the way that they know it is through types that they have that are internal. So it's not on the public API service for Roslyn, and that kind of stunk. So I had to figure that out on my own. Hopefully now I have that addressed correctly. So if you do hide methods that are virtual or abstract or in an interface, it should just work now. Constraints are generated correctly based on the type to mock. I don't know what that is, because I had a couple of other things here talking about constraints, but I think that also tied into making sure I was putting them in the order with the right amount at the right time. Members that use obsolete types. Yeah, there's another case that came up with obsolete members that I wasn't handling quite correctly, and that one was fixed. The last one's going to be fun. These next two, the async iterators and rocks. Actually, async iterators were kind of fun, because if you have a method that is an async iterator, so you implement async enumerable, when the method returns that, the method has to be implemented in a very specific way. It has to do a yield return, if I remember right. And that's not what I do. But what I ended up, it became easy, because what I could do is just say, instead of return something, I could say yield return. And if that was a return that you were returning, then it would just yield return that back to the caller, and then it would do the async iteration on that thing. But I had to do that. I couldn't just say return. So that was a little fun to do. But once I figured out how to get that to work correctly, it actually ended up, a lot of these were like, it wasn't a lot of code, but it was a lot of work to figure out how do I actually get this to work correctly. And along with this async iterator state machine, which derives from state machine attribute, basically what I should really do is say, if I ever see an attribute that derives from state machine attribute, don't omit it. And because you shouldn't do that, that's just a thing that is needed at runtime. But it's actually created by the compiler. It's not something that you would put on a method and you would make sure it's on the derived method. So as a side note, I should remember to say, just if you find an attribute that derives from state machine attribute, don't omit it. This last one, this was a lot of fun. Generated shim types. So when I originally put in support for dims, that you could basically call back to a method on an interface that actually had an implementation, I did it for a very simple case. This was a big reminder that if you think you solved it, you have to make sure that you're solving it for all the cases. And I clearly wasn't. There were a lot of complex cases that I ran into with base types and yeah, it got very confusing. It was through an interface on EF called iNavigation. That's what tripped this. And originally I thought I might have been running into a weird case where my code that was generated was going into some kind of recursive loop because the code was actually getting pushed out. I don't know if I recorded that or not, but it wasn't the format looked weird. So I thought something really bad was going on. As it turns out, I just realized I didn't have an indent minus in one spot. Once I did that, then everything lined up correctly, but I still had problems where these things weren't being implemented correctly because of what it needed to call back on and where it was in the inheritance hierarchy. So that took some time to figure out. But then the last thing with this is I ran into, like, I got this all working and I got this finally all figured out, but it still wouldn't pass for iNavigation. There were like 3 spots where there's a property called isCompleted. And there just so happens to be an extension method, which I believe is obsolete at this point. I'm not sure, but it's still there. And the compiler gets confused because it thinks I'm trying to call the extension method. And then you get this method group bool conversion bug. And I was just sitting there looking at it going, I don't know how to solve this. At this point, this.shim for whatever the interface type was is completed. I'm like, how do I get it so that it resolves correctly? Well, I finally figured out what I do is I just put casts on every member invocation in a shim, and that fixed it. That made it explicit as to what you're trying to call. Now, for all the cases I've run into, I don't need that. But I wasn't going to sit there and try to figure out, do I really need this or not? This makes it foolproof, as far as I know, that it will always call the right member, and I won't get into that case. The problem was, too, is I couldn't figure out a way to write a test to make that trigger outside of this EF instance that I found. And so, I just kind of said, screw it. Just did it a brute force way. But again, calling these things that are DIMs is kind of a rare occurrence. So I don't expect this to show up a lot, and it's just a cast. It's low cost. In fact, one of the things I'm going to do for Alpha 3 is I didn't make those unsafe as, because I've made everything now unsafe as. And so I want to be consistent there and use unsafe as, because I know it's of that type. So I want to cast it of that type. So that'll be a small change. But yeah, that's been all the stuff I've been working on since whatever the last episode was, doing it off time, off hours. And I feel better about this now. I feel a lot better because these are more cases that I'm supporting. I need to go back in the cogeneration test project and run through more cases. I have to put in a feature where some of these types that I run into have constraints on their generics that I can't just pass in int or object. And so I need to come up with a mapping. I have an idea on how to do this. It'll be laborious, but it'll be simple, but just repetitive and time consuming, annoying. But that way I can say, if you run into this type, then pass in these pieces of code into where you'd put in the generic, and then those types will just be in the console app, so they'll resolve correctly and everything will just work. But hopefully that will also let me see, are there potentially other issues that I wasn't able to see because I was just getting these things like object doesn't match the constraint of this type, and then I couldn't even examine this type. I also found through all this a odd case with a library called TerraFX, which is written by Tanner Gooding. And I was just referencing them, and I was getting like a Stack Overflow just by referencing a type, which I thought was weird. And I submitted that to him because there was 2 libraries from TerraFX that I was using to investigate, and ended up being a legit bug. And so I think he's fixed it now. But that was kind of cool too, because I wasn't using these libraries for anything other than just targets to see if rocks could handle them or not. So hopefully now I'll be, able to see if there's anything in those libraries that I can handle. But that also uncovered a bug in somebody else's library, and now they fixed it. So I find that to be kind of cool. So yeah, I want to see if there's any more things I can put in and find out for an Alpha 3. There's a couple of other minor things I want to put in there. And there was some other thing that I was going to work on, maybe on camera for this. I'm not sure. I forgot, but there's been a lot of work on rocks. And I do want to get to other things, visiting other projects and repos that I've been doing over the past years and doing more work on them. And as I've always said, there's so much more to look at and investigate and dive into, and it's always fun to do that. So that's as of right now, which again, there should be a full release of rocks, but as of right now, there's a lot of bug fixes in there, and that's a good thing. So thank you all for watching. Leave comments and questions below. See you in the next episode.